Hi, I'm Kara Eubanks, the Vice President of Supply Chain at L3Harris. We had our first introduction last week where we stressed the importance of CMMC. This now leads us into our first session, a deep dive of the Level 1 certification. We strongly encourage participation by asking many questions on this important topic. Our cybersecurity is only as strong and secure as our partners. Thank you again for your ongoing commitment. I am now pleased to welcome our partner, Neosystems, who will take us forward.
Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today to discuss the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Level 1, also known as Basic Cyber Hygiene. I'm Joe Mendegral, Director of Managed Security Services here at Neosystems. Joining me today is Ed Bassett, the Chief Information Security Officer for Neosystems, along with some folks from L3Harris who will be joining in during the Q&A session. I've been in the cybersecurity world for a good chunk of my life, spending time in the Army as an intel analyst, securing the IRS's online tax payment system, as well as the Air Force's satellite program. The satellite program was interesting because at the time, while there was very prescriptive controls surrounding classified material, as you can imagine, there was very little guidance provided to supporting systems, essentially what we might consider to be the corporate enterprise environment. Certainly, there were plenty of good security practices in place, but nothing like CMMC was required. We voluntarily built a solid program based on NIST 853 that would be similar to the CMMC Level 3. What makes me so excited about CMMC is that now we're getting some solid guidance for those organizations because it can provide prescriptive information on how to secure your environment. Currently, my role is to help organizations comply with CMMC through our Neosystems Managed Security Services. This is the second in a series of 5 webinars. Joining me today is Ed Bassett. Last week, Ed, the CISO, as I mentioned before, did an introductory session on CMMC, what to expect, and an introduction on how to prepare. The initial introductory presentation is recorded and slides can be found on our NeoSmart portal that you should all have access to at this point. That is a wealth of information, so if you didn't get a chance to attend last week, I would suggest you review Webinar 1. Today we'll be talking about CMMC Level 1 in some detail. Level 1, which is from a practices perspective, is described as Basic Cyber Hygiene, as I mentioned before. From a process perspective, level 1 doesn't look for a lot of formalized documentation, but wants to see that the practices in place are performed. There are 3 remaining webinars that include a discussion of Level 3. After that, we'll do a roundtable discussion of Levels 4 and 5. And finally, we'll wrap up with a webinar on how to prepare for a CMMC audit. All of these links are available on the NeoSmart portal. So you'll be able to register and you'll see those times, dates and times available today. So just touching upon the high-level overview of CMMC, we'll cover a few highlights from the introductory webinar without getting into too much detail from what Ed has said previously to provide some context. But again, if you'd like more information beyond what we talked about here from a high level, I encourage you to go back and listen to that original webinar. So let's start by discussing this at the highest level. This is a new unified security standard for the defense industry base. Essentially, CMMC is DoD specific. It does incorporate some previous standards such as NIST Cybersecurity Framework, NIST 800-171, CIS standards 853, and some others. For the higher levels of CMMC, there are also some controls that have been previously imposed on the defense industrial base. Have not been previously imposed on the defense industrial base. Not only does CMMC measure your technical practices, it also looks at the process maturity of your organization, although in level 1 this isn't the case. Again, going back, there are 5 levels of increased rigor. The higher the level equates to a higher level of cybersecurity expectations. In the case of level 1, the expectation is that the level of sensitivity of data is lower, so the number of controls and the maturity of the program isn't as demanding as some of the other higher levels. All levels do require an independent third-party assessment. So currently, self-assessment requirements will no longer suffice. The standard that is being published for CMMC is designed to be clear enough where you can expect a pass-fail when assessed by your independent third party. This is going to be mandatory for all the defense industrial base, but there is some acknowledgement that it is going to take some time to roll this out to all 300,000 plus contractors. So the DoD is anticipating a 5-year rollout. So while some of you may expect to see this happen in 2020, others may not see it for a few years in the future. Lastly, this is mandatory for all DoD contractors and subcontractors, so as a supplier of L3Harris, you are likely to be subject to CMMC. Ed, is there anything you'd like to add to this at a high level?
Well, at a high level, CMMC came into being because we have a history of our state-sponsored adversaries stealing intellectual property, the defense industrial base specifically, as well as some government agencies. So there's been an effort to raise the bar and really make the level of cyber hygiene that exists within industry higher than it has been in the past. Level 1 that we're going to talk about today is the one area where I would say the bar is not really being raised. These are common practices. They're required essentially today under the FAR clause around protection of federal contract information, which Joe will describe. And these are typical items that most companies have in place to protect their systems. So there's not a huge raising of the bar going on in this level. At the higher level, certainly there's some new practices. So I think as you listen today, you're going to hear practices that hopefully for the most part you say, yes, we have that. So what's new under CMMC is the idea that you're going to have to demonstrate that to an auditor, something that you most certainly probably have not had to do previously, being able to take those practices and demonstrate, yes, we have them in place, yes, we do them, and here's some evidence you can look at to see that that's going on.
Cool, thanks, Ed. So looking at the summary level of CMMC requirements by level, again, as mentioned, we'll be talking about level 1 today, which is the Basic Cyber Hygiene level, as Ed mentioned. During your processes of determining what CMMC level that is applicable to your organization, you may find that you are subject to level 3. If that's the case, it's important to understand that whatever level you are subject to, you must also satisfy the subsequent levels. Therefore, if you're going to end up being subject to level 3, you also need to satisfy the requirements of levels 1 and 2. So when you look here at this list and you look at the practices and the total numbers of the practices, what we're really saying is if you were a level 3, there's 130 practices in total, not 130 just for level 3. So we've got, today we're talking specifically about level 1, so we'll be discussing those 17 unique practices, which is a luxury for us because we can go into that level of detail, during a 1-hour conversation. In the future, as we cover other areas, we may have to summarize or discuss them in a more broad way. So as Ed mentioned, I'd like to point out that level 1 is essentially equivalent to all practices in the Federal Acquisition Regulation FAR 48 CRF 52.204-21, which you are all likely familiar with today. With that in mind, there is an exception to be audited at level 1, as we mentioned, just like with any other level. So essentially just driving home that yes, you will be audited to this level by an independent third party. It's possible to start with level 1 and then move up to a higher level if required. Let's say you initially think that level 1 is sufficient and that and then you end up working in a contract where level 3 is specified. So again, good practices to start with as you move up that ladder. Just touching upon these other areas of these other levels, a level 2 is considered a stepping stone to level 3. And aside from additional practices, which are specified there, there's an expectation that an organization establish and document all their practices and policies in a repeatable manner. So here, when we talk about level 1, it's okay to be doing things in an ad hoc way without a lot of documentation in place, but that's going to change as you move up the scale. Level 3 is required for any organization that stores, transmits, or handles CUI data at a minimum. From a maturity perspective, an organization is expected to not only establish and maintain policies and practices, but should also resource a plan demonstrating the management of activities for practice implementation. So again, from a maturity perspective, we're looking at the levels we go up. We start to create documentation. Aside from policies and some procedures, now we have to have plan documents as well. Levels 4 and 5 have some additional controls that also have a maturity expectation of maintaining a security metrics program, essentially by reviewing and measuring the practice's effectiveness. These levels are applicable to organizations that possess the highest levels of data sensitivity. DoD expects a very small number of contractors to be at those levels.
Joe, we're getting some questions in from the audience about how companies will know what level they need to be at and how to select one of these levels. So I'll just take a moment and answer that here now. The DoD will be specifying the required CMMC level on a per contract basis based on the sensitivity of data that's associated with that contract. And then it's up to the prime contractor who has the award from the DoD to determine for each of their subcontractors or suppliers what level will be required for them based on the nature of the work they're performing and the sensitivity of data. So it is about the type of data that you're going to be protecting, and I think Joe's going to talk on this next slide about some of those details. I also want to emphasize for anyone else who's listening who has questions, please submit them in the attendee question box on the webinar interface, and we will try to answer as many of those live today as we can.
Thanks for that, Ed. Yes, I know that certainly what is the applicable level to me is certainly one of the biggest questions, and having to wait until the end of the presentation to answer those can be a tad frustrating, right? So thanks for pointing that out. But that is a great segue into what we're discussing right here. So I do want to point out that while you can ask us our opinion today, and you can ask the opinion of the L3Harris folks. Ultimately, there is a contractual authority regarding what level you will be. So, but with that in mind, today we could certainly give you some guidance and help you understand what level should be applicable to you. So level 1 is really about federal contract information. And, if you're not familiar what FCI, as the acronym goes, is, well, let's talk about, it's data that's not intended for public release. Okay, so something that would be on a website is not FCI. That is public data, right? FCI's data, as FCI defines it, as FAR defines it, it's data that's provided by the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government, or data that's generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government. Now, that can be, that may seem pretty vague, but let's go on and talk about what FCI isn't. FCI doesn't include information that you would expect to see, as we mentioned, on a public website. It's also, they specifically call out simple transactional information such as necessary to process payments. Okay, where we get into a different concept here is with CUI data. As we mentioned before, CUI data is, and again, I'm looking for the how this is spelled out here. All these acronyms to me are quite a mouthful. Controlled Unclassified Information, right? That's what's known as CUI. If you have CUI in your environment, then level 3 certainly won't be sufficient. CUI is information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses on behalf of the government, that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to handle using, safeguarding, or dissemination controls. That's quite a mouthful. Essentially, and Ed, correct me if I'm wrong here, but what we're going to be looking at is that if you have data that is labeled as CUI by your prime, then you know that it's CUI, right? And then you're going to be subject at least to a level 3, almost certainly. If it's not, then the question is, well, is this FCI or is it CUI? Certainly another driver to this would be, if it's going to be level 3, that can be something that's specified within your contract. What else would you add to that?
It will be specified in the contracts. I think most people would like to know ahead of time what level they need to be at. So that's worth a discussion with your contacts at L3Harris and other primes that you work with, for different contracts that you're involved in, either bidding or already working on, to understand what kind of data is associated there and what level they're planning to require. This is all relatively new, so they may not be sure on a contract-by-contract basis, but most prime contractors will be talking with their contracting officers in the DoD to understand what the overall contract requirement is going to be, and then they'll have to make a decision for each subcontractor or supplier, based on the nature of their work, what that will be. So that should be an ongoing dialogue. Again, once it's contracted and the contract is awarded, it will be very clear. It will be a requirement spelled out in the contract, and you'll have to have your certification at that time. So the important thing is to understand as much as you can ahead of time, so that you can prepare for the appropriate target level. Level 1 that we're talking about today, I would say effectively all DoD contractors, suppliers, subcontractors should be prepared to be certified at level 1. The intent is that it's essentially everybody in the defense industrial base, with very few exceptions. And so at a minimum, the things we'll talk about today should be on your radar. As to whether you'll need a higher level, again, that's a discussion you should have with your contacts at your primes.
Great, thanks, Ed. So let's look at this flow chart here. The question is, are you already subject to FAR? If the answer is yes, I would say that one thing that we have seen a lot of questions about, and there must be an opportunity, is that if you're purely a COTS provider, with no modifications, then it's possible you may be exempt from CMMC under currently understood guidance, but that may be subject to change, right? So, like Ed said before, I think it's best to plan on being level 1 compliant. As you'll see when we get into that level of detail, these are what I would consider best practices anyway, from a security perspective. So it's really not going to hurt to be moving in that path. If there's an authority comes along and says that no, you are not deemed to be subject to CMMC, so be it. But at this point, I would intend on planning accordingly. Certainly in this decision tree, you'll notice that we're always pointing you back to work with L3Harris point of contact to determine if CMMC is applicable to you. But some general guidance there is that, again, as we mentioned before, if you have CUI data, it's likely that you're not going to be level 1. Certainly you should be looking at level 3 or potentially even higher. So CMMC Level 1 Basic Cyber Hygiene. This is an overview, basically rolling up all of the controls or practices, into some talking points. And again, this is what you'll find very similarly worded in the FAR. But there's 17 practices. And these practices are essentially technical activities. So we're talking about limiting access to your data, identifying the ability to identify users, being able to sanitize your media, limiting physical access to the environment, as well as protecting your network, so physical and IT environment protections. Find and fix system flaws, and stopping malware. None of this is really earth-shattering stuff here. Let's go ahead and jump in and talk about this. I keep building up and talking to you about what I'm going to talk to you about, and you're probably getting tired of it. So let's get moving here. So level 1, okay, if you look at this color-coded guide, anything in dark blue is applicable to level 1. In this is basically all those 17 domains that you see there: access control, asset management, audit and accountability, etc., are all of the potential domains that could be applicable for any organization at a higher level, level 3, 4, and 5. The higher up you go that scale, the more controls that are applicable for each of these domains. But at the level 1, you'll notice that what I consider to be the umbrella is the maturity of a program is not applicable under level 1. But we do have the other items: access control, media protection, and the like. It's a pretty small group overall for what's required. So in here, we're going to be talking about some specifics that we've acquired through the CMMC documentation that's already available and will be available for you. When we give you examples, I just want to stress that we can't guarantee compliance based on our advice, since each environment is unique and we haven't really received the guidance about the auditor process yet. So please bear that in mind. I mean, with that said, though, the information we're provided today isn't our speculation. What we're talking about can be found in the CMMC Appendix B, Process and Practice Descriptions, which you'll find in your training material on the NeoSmart portal. So going through the list, let's start by talking about access control. And out of those total of 17 practices, we have 4 that fall under access control. And what do those mean? Well, you can see here, just from an interpretation standpoint, there's what they call a capability. We'll call that that's an identification number, C001. And then under the description, you'll have the AC1.001. So there's essentially a breakdown for each of these requirements. So when we talk about limiting information system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices, well, what does that really mean? And honestly, this is pretty straightforward, and I would hope that everybody's already doing this by controlling who can use your company computers and who can access the company network. Limiting company device access like printers and multi-use copiers and fax machines. Essentially, don't allow your devices and network to be available to the general public, right? I mean, everybody's got protections in place, or should certainly, to do this today. So that's a pretty straightforward one. For 1.002, limit access to only the information systems, roles, or applications that individuals need to do their job. An example of this would be limiting access to HR information to only those in the Human Resource Department. This is really, the concept of a classic need to know, if you're familiar with that term, right? You don't want to have your financial data out on a public site available for everyone in the organization to look at, and therefore making it more susceptible to leakage. 1.003 only allow FCI data to be used on authorized company equipment. Essentially, don't send FCI data to a personal device that is outside the level 1 environment, such as a personal tablet or home computer. So the idea there would be, don't send it to your personal computer at home to work on it over the weekend. You need to be able to keep that data within that level 1 environment and keep it off personal devices that aren't necessarily protected to the same level of rigor as the devices in your network. And then 1.004, finally, don't allow FCI data to become public. Ensure that users understand that FCI data cannot be posted publicly. So you're practicing it, but you're also letting your user base know that that's a requirement. Typically, this would be something you would see in a policy, but again, going back to the idea that in level 1, you're really not required to have a lot of policies in place. They certainly aren't going to hurt. It's definitely a good idea to be able to share information with your users and say, hey, we have a policy that says we don't share, we don't just post our client data out on the internet, and you should know that, right? But there's nothing as it stands today that you would be audited against in level 1 that says that you must have a policy. I just think it's a good practice to be able to communicate with your user base. And it's probably advisable to limit who in your organization can post publicly from a work computer. So if there's really a business need to be able to do that, and to limit the use of, say, posting from work computers to Facebook or other non-work related sites, it would be advisable to communicate that should be limited. So to summarize access control, you should be using usernames and passwords, limit access for those with a need to know, set policies or remind users that work shouldn't be done on company computers, and restrict access to public posting from a work computer. That's essentially what you need to know for level 1 for access control.
And Joe, one of the questions that came in from the audience is whether shared user accounts are going to be allowed, that is keeping lists of in the group versus having a single ID for every user in the network. And that's something that's not specifically spelled out in level 1. So that first requirement that's on the screen talks about limiting to authorized users, but there's not a requirement to have accountability of each action that happens on the system to a specific individual. As you get to the higher levels, that is required. I would say that at level 1, you probably can get away with some shared accounts if you have a good reason for doing that. Best practice is that everyone should have their own account and use that where it's required. Again, once you get to the higher levels, it's definitely something that you need the individual accountability. So at level 1, as long as you can document or show the auditor that the people who have access are authorized, so that you have maybe a list of who they are and who would have credentials, access to those shared credentials, you probably can get by with that if you need to. I would definitely suggest going to individual IDs if that's possible.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, Ed, because actually there is a control under identification and authentication that does dance around the concept of shared accounts a little bit. So great time to bring that up, because if we're looking at the two controls under identification and authentication, IA, the first one is grant access to authenticated entities. And really what we're talking about here is that in a typical account configuration, you'll already see that, like if you're setting up an account within your Microsoft environment, for instance, you'll see that you can provide information. So what they're looking for here is that you're going to assign sufficient information to be able to identify that user with an individual. So, you know, can you add a user's full name within that when you're setting up that account, so that when you know that somebody is, say, you know, has a vague account name, it doesn't have their name necessarily embedded within the username, which isn't something that you have to do, but that you could look as an administrator and say, okay, well, user ABC at mycompany.com is actually Joe Mendegral, right? Because that's how it's set up within you know, the environment. What it kind of dances around there is, if you are using shared accounts, you do need to have a mechanism in place so that you can identify that the individuals, you know, the individuals that are using the shared account. And that becomes a big problematic, right? When you have a shared account, it's like, how can you set it up to say, if I've got 3 different people accessing a shared account, how can we actually say that Joe Mendegral was the one using that as shared account at the time that that data was leaked, right? There are potential, the guidance they provide is that IP addresses or MAC addresses of computer is the typical way that you could do this, but now it gets to be a bit more of a challenge. So really, as you mentioned, Ed, consider eliminating shared accounts where it's not required is going to be the most effective way to deal with that issue. Does that make sense to you? Do you have anything to add to that?
I don't, and I hope that answers the attendee's question.
Great. When we talk about 1.007, which is essentially don't use default system usernames or passwords, right? We hear horror stories about this. You pull a firewall or a computer out of a box. Well, if we think about a computer, it tends to come with a guest. There might be a guest account there, which may not even have a password associated with it. Those guest accounts should be disabled, or if you do need to have a guest account for some reason, maybe for support purposes, make sure you've got a good password in place. Same thing with your system devices, such as servers or firewalls. You know, a lot of security devices come out of the box and they'll have an admin account, right, which is basically gives the individual or the user access to completely reconfigure that firewall, open up ports, make things available that you don't necessarily want available. And it comes with a generally published generic password to start, so you know where to start. So before you log in, they want you to say, okay, admin account and the password is 1234. First thing you should be doing is making sure that those are changed. It's easy. I've seen it in even more mature or larger organizations where sometimes that step is skipped, and it doesn't take long at all before the bad guys suddenly can you know, find those holes in the environment. So essentially, this control is all about making sure that your usernames and passwords are locked down. There's no specific requirement at this point for a complexity of a password. That will come, I believe that comes later in different CMMC levels. But at this point, you know, they're not going to ding you for not having a 12-character password, for not using special characters. Use your best judgment when it comes to what would be a strong password. Certainly, there's plenty of help out there to provide you guidance with what would be strong. So in summary, have your network administrator set up identifiable information for each account, reduce or eliminate shared accounts, and don't use default usernames and passwords. So far, we're not seeing anything too earth-shattering in these processes, right? And that's, I believe we've done 6 out of the 17 already. The next one is media protection, and it's all about sanitizing media. Well, what is media, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about potentially paper, storage devices like thumb drives, or even mobile phones. any device that has a possibility of having FCI data on it, you need to do one of the following two options. You need to either clean or purge the information if you want to reuse the device, or shred or destroy the device so it cannot be read if you are disposing of it. There's no specific guidance when it comes to cleaning or purging, but there are options for doing DoD level disk wipes for reuse. Essentially, the expectation would be that the data can't be recoverable. With that in mind, something to consider, and I don't know if you've seen guidance on this yet. I'm hoping we will when it comes to the auditor process, but simply deleting a file does not destroy the file, right? It just takes away the header information, and the file is theoretically still there to be retrieved. So I'm interested in seeing what the auditor guidance is going to say for this one. When it comes to shredding or destroying a hard drive or phone, that can be an expensive process. You'll need to consider your contractual requirements when it comes to leases of equipment. Let's say you're leasing your desktops or laptops out there, and you're expected to return them in condition, not with a hard drive that's been shredded into a bunch of pieces and handed back to them. They're definitely going to want to charge you for that. So that's something that you're going to have to consider going forward when it comes to the data you acquire. Simply doing the DoD level wipe when you're returning it and it's going outside of your control isn't expected to be sufficient. Again, shredding or destroying of those storage devices is going to be a requirement. Ed, have you in your conversations heard any additional information about that? Because that could be one area where folks are probably not potentially meeting that requirement.
No, there hasn't been a lot of additional detail published, and I think the notion of media is starting to get a little fuzzy. You mentioned a phone. So if a phone has removable, storage, then clearly that storage item, that little chip, is media. But we haven't yet seen how they're going to apply some of those definitions to sort of modern ways of storing data. We don't have floppy disks anymore. We typically aren't even putting things on USB drives or anything. Most things are moving directly from device to device. So a little bit of waiting to see exactly what's going to be required. Certainly, if you do have physical media, that needs to be protected and sanitized, as Joe mentioned.
Great. Moving on to physical protection. So we've got 4 controls here. Consider your physical work locations. Determine areas that are not considered public spaces. That's what we're really thinking about here. The non-public spaces need to be protected from physical access. This can be achieved by door locks, old-fashioned door locks, or badging systems with card access, and of course setting up those systems so that those who don't need to access that space are restricted. If you're using a physical key system, which is not electronic, you'll need to maintain a key management system that demonstrates that the keys are numbered, can't be easily replicated, and are assigned to individuals. When those individuals leave the organization, the keys should be retrieved and logs maintained. Camera systems with DVR can also support this process. So the reason I bring that up is, there's still some organizations out there that, have to use keys, especially in certain areas where it's not theoretically or fiscally, realistic to put in a badge. For 1.132, visitors cannot be allowed to walk in your non-public areas unescorted. Visitors should be assigned a special badge indicating that they are visitors. So it should say on that so that your employees can look at them, and if they find them wandering around, they'll know that that they are a visitor and really shouldn't be there by themselves. If a non-employee is provided permanent physical access, such as a delivery person who stocks the lunchroom or performs IT maintenance, then that person can be allowed in unescorted because they are not considered a visitor at that point. 1.113, all visitors and non-visitors must be logged. If you are using a badging system, the badge logs will suffice because they log that data for you. If visitors are not assigned a special badge that will be tracked, then the visitor must sign a paper log. So in some way, that logging has to occur. If you're a smaller organization without a badge system, employees must also log in when accessing the non-public space. This might be a little unusual for organizations today, right? If people just walk into the building and sit down and go to work, well, in what way do you know that they're there? And that's what that control is saying. So, whether you had them fill out a paper log, maybe, if you're not going to use a badging system, there are some other technology-related devices that you could use to log, log that they're actually there. 1.134, I mentioned before the need to track physical keys if they are used, but protecting badges is also important. Badge systems access needs to be limited to only those with a need. So like your security guys or maybe HR, whoever is actually authorizing those badges and taking them back. All unused badges should be especially protected and tracked. Badges should be returned and secured until assigned and used again. So lock them up. Don't let those empty badges float around where they might be able to be put to use. So in summary, this is a fun subject for auditors since they, in their audit process, may try to gain access to your space without an escort. So it is something that is, to definitely consider.
Joe, one interesting question came in from the audience that kind of crosses the boundaries between physical protection and the identity items that you were talking about. And the question is, in a manufacturing environment with one computer and multiple users sharing that computer, would camera footage work for identifying individual users? Very interesting question, and I think a little bit of a judgment call there that I would say probably something to discuss with your auditor. If that's a solution you want to go with. My opinion would be no, because the camera footage is not controlling access to those computers. It's merely recording it so that you would have an after-the-fact record, but at the time access is being granted, the camera is not doing anything to determine if that person is authorized and allowing them in or stopping them based on that. The camera is a passive device. So I think that solution does not quite meet the intent of the identity and access requirements that we talked about.
It does kind of, I would agree with that. I mean, it does probably help from a compensate and control perspective if you're talking about that shared environment. But, two things really come to mind if that was an agreeable, solution. One would be that camera is going to need to be able to, be of a high enough quality that the DVR FIPS, frames per second, is set so that you can actually do facial recognition, right? Some of our cameras today, or in the past, are so grainy that you really don't know, who you're looking at. The other thing too is going to be a non-security solution, which is if this is a person's workplace, are you legally allowed to be recording them while they're sitting at their workplace? And that's going to be a local law. We run into that on occasion. Now, if it's a shared environment, maybe it's a hot desk, maybe that doesn't apply, but definitely something to consider. All right, let's move on to system and communication protection. There's two controls here. And again, we're getting back into what I would call the realm of maybe things that are a bit more straightforward. Essentially, 1.175 is saying that a firewall is required to protect the boundary of your network. For a small organization, this could be a router with a built-in firewall. Make sure that the firewall is configured to prohibit access by unauthorized personnel. I talked before about somebody being able to log in using a generic password and open up all the ports and basically allow anybody in, essentially opening the doors to the firewall. It doesn't get into a level of detail as to how to do that, but it is saying, lock it down so your authorized users should be the only ones who are able to gain access. Additionally, a web proxy should be used to restrict access to sites that are known to spread malware. So essentially having the ability to, restrict access to certain sites that are, that would have malicious data on them. Under 1.176, separate the internet from the internal network using boundary control devices, again, such as a router or a firewall. A network or part of a network that is separated from an internal network is called a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ. This is essentially call it a no man's land, where the host or part of the network is put into a neutral zone between an organization's internal network and a larger network like the internet. This is something that, if you're not familiar with doing this, might be something that you'd want to get some IT professionals to help you configure if this is not familiar. But for those that are familiar, you'll know that this is pretty standard practice. So in summary, this is pretty straightforward and typical for most organizations, although some may need some help with this concept.
Joe, one question from the audience was, if I do all my work in the cloud, do I still need a firewall at my company office? We're seeing this kind of configuration more and more, where the corporate network, which used to have servers and file servers and all kinds of infrastructure pieces, is now essentially just internet access. It's a way for people to get their laptop computers to talk to the internet, to get access to their data, which is stored in a cloud environment. So then the question is, do you still need a firewall? Well, you still need to make sure that people are not breaking into those laptops. They will still have potentially some sensitive data on them. Most routers that you would use for internet access are going to come with a firewall that's very simplistic. It says nobody from the outside can get in, only people from the inside can get out. And so that is still required. The other piece of this requirement talks about controlling what kind of websites people can visit, making sure they can't visit malicious websites and things that might do them harm. So you'll want to have some protection in place. It doesn't have to be a firewall. It could be a device that there's some software that runs on the individual endpoints themselves and protects those endpoints, or it could be at the network boundary. So there is some implementation latitude there in terms of technically how you do it, but it is still important. Even if that network doesn't have any assets other than people's laptops, it's still important to keep it protected.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unusual to, if you have a laptop in your office environment and you're accessing the cloud, there's pretty high likelihood that data gets downloaded, is cached locally or replicated locally, or in some way, are you sure, do you have some kind of protections in place that would keep your users from being able to download that data to that laptop? And if the answer is no, which I think is pretty unusual to be having that type of restriction in place, but if the answer is no, then yes, absolutely, you're going to need that firewall to protect. And it's a good practice anyway, right? Aside from this, you do need some sort of firewall protection in place to defend your devices, because they're always going to be under attack. Moving on to system and information integrity, there are 4 controls here. 1.210 is talking about patch management, ensuring that your operating systems and applications are kept up to date by running security updates and keeping up to date on supported hardware and operating systems. So for instance, upgrading to Windows 10 instead of using something like Windows 7 that's end of life and no longer provides patches, right? 1.211, this is talking about malicious code protection, and the guidance is that you should have a anti-malware tool in place. 2.212 and 2.1.3 support this as well, because not only do you need to have the anti-malware tool, but you need to keep the anti-malware tool up to date by configuring the software to automatically update. Also ensure that you have the latest version of the software itself, so updates continue to be supported. Your anti-malware tool needs to be configured to scan real time to look at files when they're downloaded, opened, or saved. The tool should also be set to scan periodically So, and they don't specify what periodically is, but periodically, so the anti-malware signatures are, as the anti-malware signatures are updated. So let's say once a week, your anti-malware software goes out and updates its signature, identifies new threats that it can go hunt for, and now when you open or opening files, or it's just generally scanning your devices, your disks and your data, it can potentially find a new threat that it didn't know about last week, right? So having it go out and do those scans in an automated way on a periodic basis are also critical. One other unique example that they call out there is such as, let's say you have a thumb drive that you find, and again, please don't pick one up out of your parking lot. If you find a thumb drive that says README, don't touch that one. But if you find a thumb drive in your desk that you know is yours and it's been sitting around for a long time, if you're going to use it, it would be great if when you do plug it in, because with level 1 there is no restriction for using thumb drives, but the expectation would be that the thumb drive would be scanned automatically. And we're just about wrapping up here. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want to save some Q&A, but you know, if you think back to those domains that I showed you and how we only had 6 domains highlighted for level 1, well, these are a lot of the exclusions that aren't required under CMMC level 1. But I'll just say that a lot of these things are good ideas, right? I mean, the idea of needing to demonstrate a repeatable process. Well, it's not required. Well, how do you do that? I mean, having those policies in place that aren't required are, again, a good idea. Security awareness training, there's a high percentage of breaches and problems that occur because of your users, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Sometimes they just make mistakes. They're not aware, you know, like phishing reminders, that sort of thing. These are all things that are good things to have. So anyway, the point here is that if you are doing these things, please don't stop. They are definitely still important controls, maybe just not something that you'll be tested against under level 1. And then, you know, one of the big questions that we hear is, what level will you need to be, right? And we've already heard that today. So essentially, think about the type of data that you have, whether it's FCI, CUI, or potentially even something more sensitive. You know, talking to your contract officer, your prime contractor, you know, each contract led by the DoD will specify the level, but the prime will determine the level for each subcontractor depending on the data and the type of work the sub is doing. So, you know, you may not have that answer today, but hopefully, you know, we're giving you enough information to at least give you a feel for where you should be. You know, we encourage you to visit our NeoSmart portal, where you'll find some great educational materials. We're constantly updating CMMC information and documentation. I think last I counted, we had over 40 articles in place and about a dozen podcasts. So there's definitely a wealth of information, as well as the information that comes directly from the CMMC. On the welcome page, we try to put the most topical information. So if we did get some big news from the CMMC, we are certainly going to point that to you, so you don't have to constantly be hunting and pecking around within that educational site to figure out if something big has come along. We also date those the materials, so you don't have to, you know, you can focus on the latest. On Monday, beginning July the 13th, our supplier compliance gap analysis tool will be available within the product. So you're going to see a little bit of a change. We're going to, when you log in starting on Monday, and a message will come out with instructions for this, but basically you're going to log in, you're going to register with using your username and create a password, and then you're going to be given some choices for multi-factor authentication. And the reason we want to have that extra level of protection is because you may choose to do a self-paced gap assessment of yourself against various levels of CMMC, right? The tool is there to help guide you and help you understand where your gaps are and help you prepare going forward in the future. Towards the end of August, you see around August 25th, we're also going to be making available some consultation services where if you need assistance in closing some of those gaps, we'll be able to provide some consulting services to assist with that process. Anything else? I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A.
I've got a few questions from the audience I want to try to get to here if we can.
Yep.
One is, where can we find the list of practices required for the various levels? So I think, Joe, you just talked about NeoSmart Portal. That does have convenience from the portal to the official DoD documentation, which has the exact details that we were reading off today in the form of the CMMC standard itself. Another kind of related question there was, can you cite exactly where CMMC states that level 3 is required if you have CUI? So I do want to point out that CMMC is not technically required of anybody yet. There is an intention to put this into the DFARS and add it to contracts over the next 5 years, beginning in 2020, at the time of contract renewal and when new contracts are awarded. So we talked about that in quite a bit of detail in webinar number 1, and I would encourage, if you didn't listen to that webinar, go back and listen to it on demand, and talks a little bit more detail about how that's going to be required. But definitely the intent of Level 3 is for contractors that store and process controlled unclassified information. So that's been well documented in the CMMC standard. Again, it's not yet a contractual requirement, but that's coming. Next is one I want to pass over to the folks from L3Harris. It says, we are required to flow down CMMC to our subcontractors. How would we determine what level we need to have our subcontractors be at? Or do we just require our subcontractors to be at the same level that we're at? So folks from L3Harris want to talk a little bit about how that process will be managed as folks that work directly for L3 are trying to manage their supply chain?
Certainly. This is Joseph Palvino from the L3Harris supply chain. So we are, of course, learning this as it goes, and it will be handled very similar to how we receive the data from the government. As part of any subcontract or order, once CMMC is officially out there, we will be flowing down the required levels and the breakdown of the required levels in our procurement orders and subcontracts as they flow to our suppliers. So if we get an order in and it says this work is level 3 and any sub work under it would be level 1, as we flow that order out to our subcontractors, we will flow that same requirements down as applicable.
Very good, thank you. Another question for L3Harris says, building to L3Harris prints would require level 3, correct?
And this is Joe again, I'll take that one. That would depend on the print you are talking about. There would be some L3Harris prints that would only be level 1 because they would only fall under that FCI federal contract information for non-public data. But some of the prints may be marked as having CUI or covered defense information or potentially export controlled or other sensitive information that would require a level 3.
Good. I think we're at the top of the hour, so I'll just one last question I'll read out and then we'll wrap up for today. Will we get a copy of this deck at the end of the webinar? And the answer is that on the NeoSmart portal, we'll be publishing an on-demand version where you can hear this again recorded with the audio. And you also will be able to download a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides. So both options will be available as soon as we get the recording back and get it published. So check back in the NeoSmart portal in the next day or two, and you should see this there. And again, not just this webinar, but we're doing a full series of 5 webinars. So on the portal will be the dates for the next. This is number 2 of 5, so there's 3 more to come. So keep an eye out for those events.